The call of respect. 96-year-old World War II veteran James "Jim" Calloway had lived through more than most could ever imagine. He had stormed the beaches of Normandy, endured the harshest winters in the Battle of the Bulge, and seen brothers in arms fall beside him. Now, in his twilight years, he enjoyed the simple pleasures of life, his morning coffee at a quiet diner, watching the sunset from his porch, and reminiscing about the past. One fateful afternoon, Jim pulled into the parking lot of his favorite roadside diner just outside of Denver, Colorado. He had been coming here for years, enjoying the warm company of the locals and the best homemade apple pie for miles. With his cane in one hand and his old leather wallet in the other, he slowly made his way inside, his military cap resting proudly atop his silver hair. As he stepped inside, the familiar chime of the doorbell rang. But today, something was different. The usual friendly atmosphere was replaced with an air of tension. Seated at the center of the diner were 5 rough-looking bikers, clad in leather jackets with patches that read, "Iron Reapers." They were big, loud, and intimidating, their laughter coarse and their presence commanding. Jim paid them no mind. He had faced scarier things in his lifetime. He walked toward his usual booth and took his seat, nodding politely at the waitress. But the bikers had noticed him. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos running up his arms, nudged his companions and smirked. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You sure you're in the right place? Shouldn't you be in a nursing home somewhere?" The others laughed, their voices booming through the diner. Jim sighed. He had dealt with bullies before, and he knew ignoring them was often the best course of action. But the bikers weren't about to let him off that easy. Another one, younger with a scar running down his cheek, stood up and walked over to Jim's table. He grabbed the veteran's cap off his head and twirled it around his fingers. "What's this? Army? Navy?" He squinted at the insignia. "Oh, look, a war hero. Think that makes you better than us, Grandpa?" Jim remained calm, his old eyes locking onto the bikers. "Son, you don't want to do this," he said simply. His voice was steady, almost gentle, but there was a steel edge beneath it. "Oh, I think we do," the biker sneered. He tossed the cap onto the floor and stomped on it. Oops. The diner fell silent. Even the waitress, who had been refilling a cup of coffee at another table, froze in place. Jim exhaled slowly, his hands clenching slightly. Then, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old, battered cell phone. His fingers moved steadily as he dialed a number. He pressed the phone to his ear and said just 3 words, "It's time, boys." The bikers exchanged glances, confused. Before they could say anything, the distant sound of roaring engines filled the air. The deep, unmistakable rumble of motorcycles, lots of them. The bikers turned to the diner's windows just in time to see a fleet of motorcycles pulling into the parking lot, their chrome gleaming under the afternoon sun. One by one, men dismounted, men who looked just as tough, if not tougher, than the bikers inside. But these weren't just any men. They were veterans. The men filed into the diner, their leather jackets adorned with patches that read, "Brothers of Valor," a veteran motorcycle club that spanned the country. At the head of them was a burly man with a grizzled face, a scar over his left eye, and an aura of authority. "You messin' with our brother, Jim?" he asked in a deep voice that carried the weight of 1,000 battles. The bikers paled. They recognized the name now, Jim Calloway. Not just a veteran, but a legend among the military community. A man whose stories had been told in hushed tones, whose bravery had been etched into history books. The leader of the bikers swallowed hard and held up his hands. "We were just joking around, man. No harm meant." Jim, now standing with the support of his cane, looked at him and said, "Pick up my cap." The younger biker who had stomped on it scrambled to retrieve it, brushing it off frantically before placing it back in Jim's hands. Jim nodded. "Now, apologize." Sorry, sir," the biker stammered. Jim studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "Good. Now, take your crew and leave." Without another word, the bikers shuffled out of the diner, their bravado gone. As soon as they were out the door, they bolted to their bikes and roared off, their tails tucked between their legs. The veterans laughed heartily as they took their seats around Jim, exchanging handshakes and claps on the back. The waitress, finally finding her voice again, grinned. "Pies on the house, gentlemen." Jim chuckled as he put his cap back on. "I do love this place." And as the afternoon rolled on, surrounded by his brothers in arms, he was reminded that respect wasn't given, it was earned. And some men had earned it 100 times over. As the bikers roared away from the diner, the tension that had filled the room slowly dissipated. The veterans, men of all ages who had served in different wars and conflicts, took their seats around Jim, their presence a quiet reassurance that he was never alone. Jim leaned back, adjusting his cap, and gave a small chuckle. Didn't think I'd have to call you boys out here for something like this. The man who had led the veteran motorcycle club inside, Mike Grizzly Thompson, smirked. He was a former Marine with a voice as rough as sandpaper and a grip that could crush stone. You know us, Jim. You call, we come. The waitress, an older woman named Betty who had worked at the diner for over 30 years, shook her head in amazement. I swear, Jim, you always have a trick up your sleeve. She set down plates of pie in front of the men, her hands still slightly trembling. I was scared they were going to hurt you. Jim smiled warmly. They were just kids looking to feel tough. They didn't know who they were messing with. One of the younger veterans, a man named Diego who had served in Iraq, leaned forward. Jim, I've got to ask, what made you call us instead of, I don't know, teaching them a lesson yourself? I've heard stories about you. The other men chuckled, knowing full well that even at 96, Jim was not a man to be underestimated. Jim took a slow bite of his pie, savoring the taste, before answering. Son, I've fought my battles. I've seen enough violence to last 100 lifetimes. There was a time when my first instinct would have been to handle things with my fists, but I learned something important over the years. He set his fork down. Strength isn't just about knowing how to fight. It's about knowing when not to. The men around the table nodded in understanding. Many of them had seen combat, had made choices in the heat of war that still haunted them. They respected Jim, not just for his past, but for his wisdom. But, Jim added with a sly grin, that doesn't mean I was going to let them walk all over me. Laughter erupted around the table, and for the first time that day, the diner felt warm again. The return of the bikers just as the mood lightened, the familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air again. The veterans turned toward the window, watching as the 5 bikers from earlier pulled back into the parking lot, this time moving cautiously. The leader, the man with the thick beard and tattoos, hesitated before stepping inside. His eyes darted around, landing on Jim and the group of veterans. Taking a deep breath, he walked up to Jim's table. The diner fell silent again. Sir, the biker said, his voice less cocky than before. I wanted to apologize. We didn't know who you were. We didn't mean any real harm. Jim studied him for a long moment before nodding. Takes guts to come back here and say that. What's your name, son? The biker hesitated before answering. Derek. Jim motioned to the seat across from him. Sit down, Derek. The biker looked uncertain but did as he was told. His crew stood awkwardly near the entrance, unsure if they should follow. Jim rested his hands on the table. Derek, you and your boys ride together, yeah? You watch each other's backs. Derek nodded. Always. Jim glanced at his fellow veterans. That's what we do too. Some of us have been doing it a lot longer than you have. He leaned in slightly. Respect isn't about being the loudest in the room or trying to scare people. It's about how you treat others, especially those who've walked roads you haven't. Derek swallowed hard, clearly taking Jim's words to heart. I get it now. We were out of line. He hesitated before adding, I didn't realize you were a vet. My granddad was in Vietnam. He always told me to respect guys like you. Jim gave a small smile. Then maybe you ought to start listening to him. Derek chuckled nervously. Yeah, maybe. One of the veterans, a towering man named Hank, spoke up. You right, kid. So do we. Maybe you should learn what it really means to be part of a brotherhood. Derek looked around at the veterans, then back at his crew. There was something different in his eyes now, respect, maybe even admiration. He turned back to Jim. Would it be all right if we rode with you guys sometime? Jim glanced at Grizzly, who nodded. That depends, Jim said. You willing to learn something? Derek smirked. Yeah, I think we are. Jim extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Derek shook it. The past few hours had changed something in him, and maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something better. The tension was gone. The lessons had been learned. And as the veterans and the young bikers sat down together, the diner became a place of stories, respect, and newfound understanding. And Jim? He just enjoyed his pie, knowing that even at 96, there were still lessons to teach, and still roads left to ride. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting golden hues over the diner's parking lot, the once hostile bikers now sat among the veterans, sharing stories, laughter, and plates of Betty's famous apple pie. The tension that had once filled the air was long gone, replaced by a sense of camaraderie that neither group had expected. Jim sipped his coffee, listening as Grizzly and Hank exchanged tales of their time in service with Derek and his crew. The young bikers had started asking questions, not out of obligation, but genuine curiosity. They weren't just hearing war stories, they were learning about sacrifice, honor, and the kind of brotherhood that transcends generations. At one point, Derek leaned forward, glancing at Jim's worn leather jacket, which bore a patch with a symbol he didn't recognize. "What does that patch mean?" he asked. Jim looked down at it, a small smile playing on his lips. "That," he said, tracing the emblem with his fingers, "is from my old unit, the 101st Airborne. We called ourselves the Screaming Eagles." Derek's eyes widened. "You were in the 101st?" He looked at his crew. "That's legendary, man." Jim chuckled. "Well, we did what we had to do. And we looked out for each other, just like you boys do." Derek nodded, his respect for the old veteran deepening. "I get it now. It's not about looking tough. It's about standing for something." Jim set down his coffee cup and looked him in the eye. "Exactly." A comfortable silence settled over the group as the last rays of sunlight faded. Then, Grizzly clapped a hand on Derek's shoulder. "All right, kid. You said you wanted to ride with us sometime. How about tonight?" Derek's face lit up with surprise. "Seriously?" Jim pushed himself up from the booth, grabbing his cane. "You boys got bikes, don't you? Then let's ride." The veterans and bikers made their way outside, the roar of motorcycles filling the evening air. Derek and his crew, who had arrived at the diner thinking they were the toughest men in the room, now found themselves among warriors who had fought battles they could only imagine. As they rode down the highway, the wind rushing past them, Derek realized something. This wasn't just a ride, it was a lesson, an initiation into something greater than himself. And Jim? He rode at the front of the pack, his heart light, knowing that even after nearly a century of life, there were still ways to make a difference. Because respect wasn't given. It was earned. And tonight, it had been.